What's up, everybody? I'm Jason. Welcome back to another episode of the podcast here on the Points in Focus YouTube channel. And this one is a podcast, or is something I have been starting to think about more and more, and it really sort of took off with legs and got running a couple weeks ago when I started shooting my stuff on the autofocus on the R5C, and when the R5 Mark II was announced and its autofocus capabilities. And I also simultaneously ran into a video from a Emmy Award-winning documentary cinematographer or documentary filmmaker who was talking about the video I ran into was the five amateur things that I wish I knew for earlier, or wish I stopped doing earlier, or something like that. And his number one point there was about focus. And it's pretty clear to me that we are moving into the era of AI. I put that in sort of air quotes because for a lot of stuff, it feels like we're playing buzzword bingo. And this is certainly, I would say, true for example, with cameras, that, you know, we're talking about more AI this and AI that. And yes, there is machine learning, which is a part of the whole artificial intelligence thing going on in the subject detection, and certainly in the training and the algorithms that are used to do subject detection. But this isn't, I guess, in some respects, it's not the first time that camera companies have slapped AI on a product or a camera or whatever and talked about focusing. Canon always called their tracking focus AI based. Even though I don't think there was any actual machine learning or artificial intelligence in it. But what I want to sort of do or talk about in this video is sort of where we're at and maybe where we could go. And now I don't pretend to be an expert in, well, first of all, machine learning. I've tried to do some stuff to understand what's going on under the hood from a programmatic perspective. It's a little bit over my pay grade. I also don't use the gear in the same way that every other photographer uses their gear. So talking about things, there are going to be those of you out there who may be listening or watching this who have different use cases than I do. And I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments on where you think this could go, but how you think this could be applied, and what forth. So I want to talk a little bit about, before I get into the whole AI thing, I want to really talk about what autofocus has with respect to problems and what the problems really aren't. When it comes to things that I think frequently get sort of attributed to autofocus as a problem, but really isn't actually a problem with autofocus, it comes up a lot in terms of the capability to focus. And that's something I don't actually think is a problem with autofocus. So the capacity to measure focus or focus errors, the computer can do it way better than you can. That's just the reality of it, especially in a phase-based system. So we're talking Sony, Nikon with the embedded phase pixels in their sensors, Canon with the dual pixel AF sensor and the capability of using the whole sensor as a phase-based autofocus system. First of all, that doesn't see the world the way that we see the world. If you've ever used a manual focus camera with a split prism rangefinder or a split prism focusing aid, that's much more akin to how your camera sees the world when it's doing focusing. It is not, at least a phase-based camera, phase-based autofocus system. It is not looking at detail or whatever. It is looking at, do two offset images line up? And when they do, the image is in focus. Now, yes, there are certain edge cases that can cause problems for that. So you do have the issues with orientation of contrast. If your contrast perfectly lines up with the orientation that the sensor is sensitive to or isn't sensitive to, then it can have a hard time or won't be able to measure a change in focus or an error in focus because the contrast that it's looking at isn't there. This is, you know, one potential problem, but this is also sort of, and I won't say a complete edge case, but it is a bit of an edge case in the fact that, you know, there's a lot of things that kind of go to mitigate that. For example, on the EOS R5, Canon's contrast or phase-based autofocus, there is no contrast-based, as far as I can tell in any of the testing I've ever done, there is no contrast-based backup on Canon's cameras. It is pure phase-based autofocus all the way. And on the R5, at least, at 45 megapixels, it's really hard to create a situation where you have horizontal contrast only that only can't trigger the camera. It happens, don't get me wrong. It's not, I'm not saying it can't happen, but it is one of those things where because of the resolution of the sensor, I've had it lock onto dust on a completely smooth surface, and that was all it needed for the focusing, or a scratch, a hairline scratch in a completely smooth uniform surface, and it locked on with for focusing. So it can happen, but it's increasingly edge casey. And then, of course, with a camera like the EOS R1 now, with having the contrast or the phase-based, the dual pixel orientation, both vertically and horizontally, it's not really going to be an issue there at all. Nikon and I think Sony both have contrast as sort of the final backup thing. They use the phase information to determine the gross error, focus error, and then when they get to the final tightening up to the last bit of getting everything in focus, it switches to contrast base. The point is I'm kind of derailing myself, is that the camera can measure focus far better than we can looking at a viewfinder, far better than we can with a tape measure doing it the Hollywood style and a well-calibrated lens. Likewise, the camera can drive lenses to focus much, much faster and more accurately than we can. And you know, you don't even have to look at cameras to realize this. Like, go look at CNC machines. They are moving pounds, like way more weight than the camera has in the lens and the focusing element, faster in some cases than the lens and focusing elements are, and with the same or better accuracy. We're talking micron level precision in some cases on high-end CNC machines. Of course, that's a lot of power to drive a lot of weight very quickly. Camera lenses are a lot lighter, they don't need as much power, but we can still build control systems, and cameras already have control systems in them to drive a lens vastly faster than you would be able to do it sort of manually with any precision. Like, yeah, you can turn the focus ring on a lens super fast, but you're not going to hit a specific target quickly. The problem with AF isn't that. It's not that it can't drive the camera lens or be accurate. The problem with AF that really is the, you could say, tripping block for photographers and cinematographers especially, is that it lacks context. It's the things that we know about what's going on that the camera just doesn't or can't. And quite honestly, the camera isn't going to know this anytime soon. It's the second assistant camera operator who knows who's speaking which lines in which order and what the lines are and what they're going to end at, and so they can start the focus move to the other character just as the first character speaking stops speaking their line and the second character starts, and everything looks completely seamless. And it's not the fact that they're good at pulling, or that they're good at the mechanical point of driving the lens to focus. More than likely, they have hard stops and they've measured out to where the marks are, and they're actually using depth of field to cover up the fact that they can't, or they aren't precisely hitting super accurate focus every time. It's within depth of field for that situation, and therefore it's fine. It's that they have the context of knowing what's going on and what they should be pulling focus to and when. And that's something our cameras don't have. And quite honestly, given the computational costs and processing, even with AI and machine learning and Moore's law and all of that, that's not something I foresee coming really anytime soon. I don't see the camera suddenly having the ability to understand who's speaking and who should have the camera or the focus put on them so that they're, that kind of thing. So that raises some questions, I think, in terms of, well, what can we do to deal with this? And some of it is, I don't think my intent here, strictly speaking, is to say completely disregard the position of a assistant camera or focus puller in Hollywood, or in any situation where you have that kind of capability. I'm not even sure that, although that said, I'm not even sure that that position should be doing what they're doing the same way they're doing it. There's obviously, in any professional context, there's always a significant hurdle, is the best way I could put it, to change. If you're making your money doing something a certain way and you do it well, not doing it that way is a risk. Changing how that gets done is a risk to your financial situation, to your ability to produce what you're supposed to do your job, etc. And obviously, nobody wants to lose their job, and nobody wants to not be able to continue to perform because things have changed. So that said, there of course is an entirely different aspect now that we're running into with, well, what amount to cinema cameras and even to a certain extent cinema lenses trickling down market. The reality is when Canon got into the cinema camera industry, they really sort of tossed things up, and cameras like the R5C, which was only $4,200, and the C70, which was only like $5,000 or something to that effect, $4,800 when it was released, and even things like the C200 and C100 brought down the cost of entry to the cinema camera world to a level where people who aren't Hollywood production levels are using it. And they also brought things to that market space like autofocus that really wasn't there in a coherent or well-designed way, or not well-designed, internally operated, I guess is what I'm trying to say, way. Like, yeah, you could do focus peaking because your monitor had peaking and you could use a follow focus or a remote follow focus or something like that. But there wasn't the internal autofocus feedback loop, for the most part that I'm aware of, prior to Canon kind of really getting into the whole thing. Especially with the dual pixel sensors. Like, I don't think if anybody else was doing autofocus, it was either because there was a beam splitter and a phase array, or they were doing contrast-based autofocus. And we all know that contrast-based autofocus is not really good for video because it doesn't know which direction the camera has to focus to go into focus. So you always get that like out of focus jitter that every time a focus pull starts. So we're talking about things, or we're thinking about things, I think at least, that are supplementary, that are helpful, and that are especially useful to those people who aren't with the budget or the production scale or the size to be shooting with full camera crew. And then as well, things like where a full camera crew, where your focus puller has even more tools at their disposal on that full camera crew to do the job even better. So speaking of AI coming into focus and the focusing systems, I think two big AI points have been, of course, face detection and the extension of that, which is sort of, I won't say arbitrary subject detection, but non-human subject or face detection. So the whole insects, birds, you know, all of that kind of stuff, as well as things like cars and planes and whatnot. So that whole thing is certainly one aspect of it. But we've also certainly seen camera companies trying to do something to improve the autofocus as a whole with machine learning based stuff in the background that isn't quite necessarily as obvious. The first place that I really saw this was when Sony announced the A7 R5, and that included pose recognition. And Sony talked about how pose recognition, if you go and read what they've kind of said, is basically to help the camera understand where the person's head is so that it can get faster focusing on the head, face, or eye. It can recognize other stuff, but it really isn't being based on their marketing. And unfortunately, I don't have an A7 R5, and even if I did, I don't have a really good idea how to isolate and test this coherently. So this is really kind of based on their marketing. I didn't get this. And to a certain extent, I still don't get this because Sony seems to be very good at building the sensors and cameras that they build, and they seem to be very good at being able to do the face recognition and whatnot, and needing to be able to track a relatively static, because they in all of the marketing I've seen from them on this, it's always been focused on like models and relatively static poses. And for a camera that is not super high frame rate, it's only 10 frames a second, which, I mean, okay, 20 years ago, we'd be calling that a rockin' fast camera. But today, it's not the sports powerhouse. And at 60 megapixels and 10 frames a second, I have a hard time calling the A7R a sports camera. That's the A9 or the R1 or the R3 or the Z9 or whatever. But I didn't quite understand, and I still don't, why Sony needs pose detection to detect heads and faces instead of just the head and face detection. How much that really actually helps. And I'm not saying it doesn't help, and I'm not saying it's pointless. I just kind of don't quite follow. It feels more like that buzzword bingo that I was talking about, that, oh, look, it's AI and it's pose detection, and really all it's doing is pointing the camera to where the face should be or where the eye is a little bit faster. Now, with the R5 Mark II and the EOS R1, Canon has also introduced pose detection or pose recognition. And this I understand a little bit better, and largely because it's aimed at completely different sort of point. Canon isn't talking about this for your static subjects. They're talking about it for dynamics and sports. They're talking about it in football or soccer or however you want to call it. They're talking about basketball. They're talking about, I think it was volleyball or something like that. Sports where you have a person who could go from a very static position to a very dynamic position very quickly. And of course, regardless of what your autofocus system is doing, there always has to be a dead zone, if you will, a damped factor in how the focus system's moving. Put it another way, like I said, the camera is very good at measuring focus. It can tell that I have moved forward an inch or two just sitting here talking to the camera. Now, what you don't want the camera to do, and this is especially true when shooting video, is every time I make a tiny little movement that the camera can detect and measure, drive the focus as fast as the camera can move to that new position. It's especially in video, it is better for me to be slightly out of focus and then slowly brought back in focus when I'm sitting here than it is for me to be constantly perfectly in focus, but then you get all of the distraction and messed up background that comes from the constant adjustments. Like, you will see it. Even if the lens doesn't breathe, you will be able to see the change in bokeh, you will be able to see subtle changes in the background, and it will be distracting, probably. Like, it's something you want to avoid. And even for still photography, you don't, like, there is still, I know there's several websites who've said that mirrorless cameras don't need predictive AF, that's crap from DSLRs, and mirrorless cameras are completely reactive, and that's not really true. There's always some lag going on between when even when the camera measures focus and when focus is the lens moves to that position, or the image is made, or whatever. There's always some lag. And again, for somebody who's standing relatively still and you don't want to have the camera constantly freaking out. I mean, and refocusing and messing things up. So there's always a little bit of predictive behavior going on. The big advantage, of course, with mirrorless cameras is that we don't have anywhere near the shutter lag that you used to have with a DSLR. You don't have anywhere near the, call it blackout time, for lack of a better way, that you had with a DSLR. So in a DSLR, once the mirror goes up, the focus sensor is completely blacked out. It just as the viewfinder is. In fact, once the mirror starts moving, you can't make any measurements from the focus sensor. Whereas on a mirrorless camera, if you're shooting or if your sensor is running at, say, 120 frames a second, which the R5 will do if you have it in the high frame rate viewfinder mode when you're shooting stills. And of course, you can't shoot at 120 frames a second, but the image can be pulled from the sensor 120 times a second, which in theory means, given the dual pixel AF, it could be measuring focus 120 times a second. And this is true. This isn't just true for Canon. This is true. Sony has stuff that runs the autofocus system at 120 frames a second. I'm not sure actually what Nikon does, but I would not be surprised to see 60 or 120 hertz focus polling. That's way faster than 50 milliseconds or something like that from the last focus measurement to 120 frames a second or 120 hertz gives you a poll time of somewhere around, I think it's 8 milliseconds per, from polled frame to the next frame, which for most things is functionally, there's nothing going, it's functionally instantaneous. But for some things, specifically very fast things or very rapidly accelerating things, that 8 milliseconds may not be enough. So like I said, the algorithms still have a level of prediction in them. Now, where you run into a problem with this is, for example, in a sporting situation where you have somebody who's relatively still waiting to catch the ball, or crouched ready to jump, and then all of a sudden they jump. You have a very high acceleration, potentially towards the camera, and you have a focus system that's designed by and large to sort of damp that acceleration out to keep things moving a little bit smoother. And this is, of course, especially true in video, where you're going to just run away from the focus pretty much instantaneously. And so Canon, where they're talking about pose detection on the R5 Mark II and the R1, is they're talking about basically using it, this is my interpretation of their marketing material, using it to override the damping factor. So it knows from the position that it's estimated the person in and that we are playing basketball that the person is going to very quickly accelerate, and so not to lag the focus behind when that happens. At least that's, like I said, my interpretation of what's going on. But clearly, either way you go, whether you're talking about Sony's pose detection or Canon's pose detection, we have abilities now for the camera to do something to measure pose and use that with respect to driving the autofocus system. Whether it's acceleration or better locating or easier locating of a feature like the face or the eye. So the question then is, and I don't necessarily have answers to these, but how could we apply pose detection to cinematography? Outside of basically the simple, well, it makes the camera know that the person's playing basketball, which certainly is going to be useful in certain types of filmmaking or certain types of situations. So I think in answering to the question of is it relevant to cinematography, I think actually it is. But the question that I don't have an open answer to or a good answer to is how can we apply it beyond what I just talked about? Certainly there's the potential to use pose detection in a broader context if we can figure out what that context is. The next thing I kind of going back to with the AI stuff, well, this is all kind of AI stuff, but the next kind of AI point that I wanted to talk about is face priority. And forgive me if somebody else's cameras do this and I'm missing it. I don't own every brand that's on the market, and so this is not necessarily a function that I've looked through every manual for every camera. But starting with the EOS R3, Canon introduced a system that they called face priority. And of course, this is now available on the R5 and the R1. And the idea here is that you can take a picture of somebody's face and save it to the camera as a priority face, and then go into the environment, and the camera, instead of locking on to whatever arbitrary face it finds, it can still do that, but it will prioritize the face of the person that you are told the camera to prioritize. So in a journalistic sense, this could be a major dignitary or, you know, something like that, a CEO, whatever. And when you go in to take the picture of the press event, the camera isn't just going, oh, random person, I'll focus on that person over there that nobody cares about. It will actually recognize the face and focus there as your priority. Now, of course, this makes a ton of sense in a still journalistic sense, as far as I'm concerned. I can totally see how you would not, or you would want the camera or want to be able to have your camera automatically jump to the important person before it focuses on somebody who isn't as important or isn't important. I also think this is incredibly, or has a ton of value, I should say, in cinematography. In complex scenes where you want to have the camera track a specific person in a crowd, face priority could conceivably give us the capability to do that. And not, I mean, again, you still have all the other tools. I'm not saying that you can't, but for especially a low budget or no budget filmmaker who is working, you know, in college with their friends or whatever, and they can afford a fairly high-end mirrorless camera, but they can't afford necessarily to have a focus puller and everything else on every set for every shot that they do, especially, you know, if you're doing guerrilla stuff and you don't want a big crew. You know, that's kind of antithetical, that you want to be as light and small and fast as you possibly can be. This could be one of those things that's really valuable in terms of AI assistance in the focus system. Which leads me to another thought on the whole thing with face priority, which is, can we extend this? Well, not us per se, but can the camera manufacturers extend this? So face priority is working based on the face detection models, but could this be something that gets extended to arbitrary subjects? Even if it's something that's simplified, where you have to take the pictures of these subjects in the light and sort of setup that you are going to shoot them in, but the camera could then immediately, as you're moving the camera through a scene, know what things in the scene potentially you want it to focus and track. Again, arbitrary is not, you know, not just people's faces. I mean, of course, people's faces are always kind of the focus, I guess you could say, for what we're talking about or what we're shooting for, you know, subjects and documentaries or whatever. In most cases, you know, barring, say, a wildlife documentary or something like that. But there's always little B-roll scenes that you may run into where, if you're shooting kind of solo, it's really difficult to move the camera, track focus, and do all this other stuff. But what if you could tell the camera, this keychain is something that I want you to focus on, or this shot glass is something I want you to focus on. And then you're kind of no longer restricted to the moving the camera laterally only within that realm, or moving the camera along a very specific path and not being able to, like, you know, only having focus pass over something. Like, you could potentially have a much more complicated camera move, which obviously a big Hollywood production could do, because you could program it in with a robot or something that costs thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. Not so easy to do handheld unless you can kind of get your camera to track this. So that's another thought I've been thinking about, is, can we extend this whole idea of face priority into better tracking of arbitrary things on demand, like based on what we tell the camera to do? Now, this is the point where I don't have an answer. I'm kind of throwing this out, and maybe you could throw your thoughts in the comments, but there's surely room for more things to be added or improved. And this is one thing I have thought about, one of the problems with the camera comes down to sort of pulling focus. It doesn't pull focus the way a person pulls focus. It pulls focus away a camera pulls focus. But could we use sort of machine learning to train the camera to build a more natural focus pull? Now, some of you I know are going to say, who cares, just whatever, this is stupid. Some of you are certainly going to be far more interested in the nuance of what's happening, and are going to be more observant, if you will, to, well, when I pull focus, it gets pulled a certain way, or when people, like when I'm watching a movie pulled focus, focus pulls in a movie, it's done a certain way, well, because a person's doing it, and I can't kind of capture that when I'm shooting on a camera. Now, I know sort of one way to do this would be to have eases in some respects without even getting into the sort of AI kind of thing. It's simply fast acceleration at the start and then slow pull into focus at the very end. That kind of mirrors how I'm pulling focus when I'm pulling focus is the bulk of the move at the beginning where everything is out of focus and I'm getting to the thing tends to be a bit faster than the fine tune at the end, which is going to be really slow and gradual to make it not be super obvious. But certainly even in theory, and even like in our own cameras, potentially you could start building in the ability to train the camera based on you pulling focus, how you accelerate, decelerate, and so forth, so that maybe the camera can focus more naturally, is the way I guess I'm putting it. I also wonder if we couldn't use the AI machine learning stuff to do something to improve focus hunting. Focus hunting obviously is a real problem in, well, pretty much everywhere. In stills, it slows everything down, but it's kind of a necessary thing when the thing you're trying to focus on is outside of the range that the camera can measure. But in video, focus hunting is kind of really distracting. And now, Canon, at least on their Cinema EOS cameras, does have the ability to control the autofocus system so that it will only focus and track on faces. It won't hunt for anything that isn't a face. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it can't misidentify something in the scene that you're in as a face, or that it won't necessarily jump to another face if there's somebody else in the scene. But well, I guess the first question is why isn't this more standard? Like, this should be a standard capability on everybody's video camera platform. I mean, Canon should be putting this in their regular EOS cameras. Nikon and Sony should be putting this in their everything that shoots video cameras, whether it's a cinema camera or a, I mean, this should just be a standard thing. And going back to the whole, like, face priority or arbitrary subject priority, how difficult would it be potentially, this is a rhetorical question, but to extend this focus hunting or anti-focus hunting face priority tracking mode or face only tracking mode to arbitrary objects? If I tell the camera, if I can use the pose or the face priority stuff in an arbitrary way, and I can tell the camera only focus on this object, whatever that object is, then could I also not, or would not it also make sense to have the ability to say also, and only focus on that. If that leaves the frame, don't start hunting for something else to focus on. So yeah, that's some food for thought. As we're getting cameras that are getting faster processors and now AI co-processors and more focus on, in some cases, what feels like buzzword bingo AI stuff, and in other cases, what feels like actual improvements through machine learning technology, can we get more? Can we use this to get more advantages out of our camera? Well, I think the answer to that is yes. But the question is what and how can we do to get that? Or what and how would be useful to have that have? So, as I said as I open this, if you have an idea on this or something's crossed your mind on this, let me know in the comments. Because I think this is certainly a discussion I have never seen anywhere else. I've never seen any other photographers talking about, like, what would I like to see the AI or the focus system be able to do? What would help me? What makes sense? And I don't think still photography is a completely solved problem on this. I think it's an easier problem because you don't necessarily have the focus pulls aspect. The racking focus isn't such a problem. But the processing, tracking, discovering, understanding, etc., certainly is not an unsolved problem there either. So, like I said, chew on this a little bit and think about it. Think about what you think would be useful and let me know in the comments. So if you found this podcast interesting, let me know by hitting that like button. If this kind of thing seems like it might be your kind of thing, please consider subscribing if you aren't already. Finally, if you'd like to help and support this channel, you can help us by liking this video and sharing it. And you can support us directly by hitting that thanks button or buying yourself something you've always wanted from one of the affiliate links in the description below. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.